Sweet. Oh no. um, remember last time when we talked about yep, yep,
Look at me. I figured it out. Look at
dude, you're a
me,
wizard.
bro.
You're a hairy wizard.
What the fuck? I'm retarded. I think I figured it out. Let's make sure.
Oh no.
It's catching up.
um, remember last time when we talked about
Remember last time?
yep. Look at me. I figured it out.
Oh, look at me. Yep, yep, there you go. I got it. I had it.
Nailed it.
I'm fucking so proud of myself, bro. So, last time we were talking about place cells and we were talking about like Descartes and stuff. And, like, what, if anything, can we know for certain? And foundationalism is the strand of epistemology that says we can only ever know something for certain if somewhere along the line we can trace it back to an undoubtable, irrefutable truth. And Descartes began this journey by observing that our human senses are like unreliable. And this idea became later known as Cartesian doubt or skepticism. But Cartesian skepticism in general is a skepticism that relies on the observation that our judgments about a certain area, like the external world, the future, other minds, are undetermined by our evidence for them, experience present or like observable behavior. And this brings to light the possibility that none of our judgments in these areas are justified. Like, given that our perceptions would be exactly the same if we were dreaming, like deceived by an evil demon, or our brain was in a vat. Like, how do we know that anything is fucking real, right? And our perceptions seem to give us no justification for thinking that we are actually in contact with tables, chairs, the external world, rather than being in one of these other situations, right? So how do you know for sure that you're not dreaming right now? Or how do you know for sure that you're not just a fucking brain inside of a vat, or we're all living in a simulation? It's all the same problem that Descartes started with. And this idea of this mind-body duality is what comes when you start to see this, right? Because what he ended up figuring out was cogito ergo sum, and it's literally translated to I think therefore I am, is the first principle of Rene Descartes' philosophy. He found that he could not doubt that he himself existed, as he was the one doing the doubting in the first place. This created the largest philosophical problem, which is that we don't have direct access to reality. All of it is mediated through our senses. And this idea of mind-body duality did not start with Descartes. It's so there's like this old. Have you ever watched The Blood of Zeus on
No.
Netflix? So it's a fucking super dope cartoon on Netflix or anime. But it's about a story that's way fucking older, and it's way more esoteric, and it's more of an Orphic than it is a traditional Greek story. It's about Zagreus. So Zagreus is a child of Zeus and Persephone, and he was killed and eaten by the Titans, except for his heart, which was found by Athena. And then Athena brought it to Zeus. Because his heart was saved, Zagreus was able to be reincarnated as the god Dionysus, and Dionysus is like a huge part of the canon of Greek mythology. He's like supposed to be the first deity or the first thing that emanates from reality. Well, him and Phanes, but that's besides the point. So Zeus punished the Titans for their treachery by destroying them with a thunderbolt, and it was from their ashes that humanity was born. So the first thing right there is that humanity was born from the Titans. And followers of Orphism believe that humanity had a dual nature, one of the body inherited from the Titans, and one of the soul, or the divine spark, inherited from the parts of a god, Zagreus, at this time. And it was the... So Orphism, to achieve salvation through acts of atonement during their lifetime, or else be cursed with endless reincarnation, is like a prime part of Orphism. The suffering, death, and resurrection of Dionysus, and the idea of redemption of an original sin, call to mind aspects of later religions like Christianity, right? And the modern adaptation of the story is in the blood of Zeus. So even back then, they were having these ideas. You know what I mean?
Right.
So this problem comes where, like, where the fuck do we actually know what reality is? Like, how do we know? In modern physics and modern physics hasn't even really described this, because what's outside of the observable universe?
Nobody knows.
You know what I'm saying? And then in my observable universe, the only thing I know for sure is I'm real. That's the only thing I can know. Because I agree with his first principle, like, I think, therefore I am, but it's more of like, I am aware, therefore I am. Like, I can't be aware of anything else other than what I'm aware of. But when we're talking about this, then you start to get into Kant and Hume and these other skeptics. And Kant basically says that there is two innate senses that are given to us. And that is the sense of time and the sense of space. And it was super hard for me to understand what the fuck he was talking about until I came across these grid cells and these place cell things. And that's kind of where I want to start here with this dude. So this gentleman here is, what the fuck is his name? Lynn Nadel. He's actually the Regent Professor of Psychology at University of Arizona. So him and John O'Keefe in the 70s, bro, found place cells. And what he's going to say here is blew my mind, because when you're reading his book, they make predictions in the 70s of what other cells we are likely to find because place cells exist. And just a little hint, we ended up finding them 20.
Oh shit! That was my follow-on question.
20 years later, and
so in the 90s,
later,
this continued.
Yes, so all the way up until 2014. So,
are there any new studies on this at all?
It's continuous. Like it's ever expanding. But this is like the baseline of all of this.
Right.
We'll start with this gentleman here.
Thank you, and I have to call her Lucy. I mean, apparently everyone calls her Lucia now, but it's always been Lucy. Thank you very much, Lucy, for inviting me to this. This is really a very meaningful meeting for me, and I was happy to be able to come at this point. I teach the history of psych, and I teach a variety of classes, and every time I introduce the issue of Tolman, I start by talking about his politics. I mean, it doesn't start with what he said about cognitive maps. For me, it starts with what an amazing person this was. So for me, this really is a personally rewarding moment to be able to stand here in this faculty club where he led the revolt on this campus, and to be able to contribute to this. So thank you for that. So I'm going to be very brief. I'm just here to do a brief introduction and make a few small points. Well, maybe not so small, but smallish. And I'm going to be repeating a few of the things that Dr. Dewsbury mentioned earlier in the day, for those of you who were at the morning session. But it starts with this observation, one of the observations that Tolman made. This is a quote from that famous Psych Review paper in 1948. But the few points I want to make really are about the fact that actually there was more than just the notion that there are cognitive maps in the brain. And a bunch of those ideas came out this morning, but I want to highlight a few of them because they're very important for the theory that O'Keefe and I then developed, and for the sort of the way the rest of the field perhaps continued. So one point that Tolman mentioned about when he brought up the notion of cognitive maps, and this was already mentioned earlier today. Can you hear me back there? Good. Was the notion that these maps may actually come in multiple scales, right? There's narrow strip map, there's a comprehensive broad map. That idea that there are kind of different grains of mapping is an important idea. That actually we now know that there's data to support that idea.
So this right here, right? This idea of two different types of maps is a little bit more abstract than meets the eye the first time. Because my wife literally just texted me something earlier about when somebody tells you it's just north down the road, and then your response is, all right, Lewis and Clark, is it next to the Chick-fil-A or do I take a left? Right? So in this book that they wrote, bro, and when I tell you this book is fucking crazy, I mean it. Like, I'm super into land navigation because of the Army, and all of us who are into land navigation, there's some interesting statements that they make about maps. And one is, there's two different ways to do this, and one of them is like the Chick-fil-A is a landmark, and you can use the landmarks to get around. And then the other one is more of an allocentric, like a polar directional thing, right? From me, egocentric is what it's called. So from me, where I am relative to the rest of the space. But it's also the same thing. If you go back to our very first video about Afghanistan, and we were talking about direct, organizational, and strategic, these maps that we have cognitively, socially, are separated in those areas too, right? Direct is like one-to-one interactions, like how things go, how in my everyday life I interact with people, and then how the aggregate of that interacts around me, like the organizations that I take part in, and then strategically are the things that I see the world as being. And this is one of the things that we talk about a lot on the side, and I don't know if I've ever said this on video, but I think the reason why veterans as a whole are more primed for this leadership role type stuff is because we've literally had more access to space. Like, we've lived on the other side of the world. You know what I'm saying? And it's not like, because I can say that when I was younger, I would read in books about Germany, and my great-grandfather fought in World War II, right? So everything I knew about Germany was it's like there's a bunch of Nazis over there.
Evil,
And then I got stationed there, and I was like, wait, hold up.
Yeah.
They're just as free as we are, if not more. And there's like way cooler shit over here. Like, the government pays these kids to go to school and pays for their apartment, and they get to go to college. Like, what the fuck? If you have a baby, you have like 3 years of paternity leave paid at like 100%. And then every year after that, it starts to decrease, and they have to hold a position for you or one relative to the same pay scale. Could you imagine what that did to these children growing? Anyway, that's besides the point. But, but so these maps become a little bit more abstract than these direct representations of space.
Sure. Can I hold you for just a moment?
Yeah.
So one of the things he said in his intro, and it might have just been like I might be overreading his wording a little bit, but he said like "thank you" or "we led the revolt" in some way, and the thought that spurred from that is there a counter argument occurring to these philosophies?
So when you go back to what date was it when he came out with that quote? Was it the 40s? Yeah. So 48. You have to. It's the Psych Review. So you have to think about what psychology was in the 40s, and psychology in the 40s was behaviorism. Purely the brain. Everything inside of somebody's brain was a black box.
Lobotomies work. Yeah.
So,
this is fine.
So when you started to say things about the internal workings of somebody's mind, science was like, nah, bro, go fuck yourself. Like that's voodoo shit, right? And that kind of goes along the same idea or the line of thinking where why we as a society are so emotionally unintelligent. You know what I'm saying?
Oh yeah.
Because these people raised us, and they didn't believe emotions were real, so they weren't real, and then so on and so forth. But
or at the very least, were needed to be suppressed.
Yeah.
There are cognitive maps in the brain. And a bunch of those ideas came out this morning, but I want to highlight a few of them because they're very important for the theory that O'Keefe and I then developed, and for the sort of the way the rest of the field perhaps continued. So one point that Tolman mentioned about when he brought up the notion of cognitive maps, and this was already mentioned earlier today. Can you hear me back there? Good. Was the notion that these maps may actually come in multiple scales, right? there's narrow strip map, there's a comprehensive broad map. That idea that there are kind of different grains of mapping is an important idea. That actually we now know that there's data to support that idea. I don't know if Edward's going to say anything about that in particular, but this general idea has survived, and it's an important idea. Not just that there are maps, but there are different kinds of maps, right? Second thing, he also wrote a very famous paper called There's More Than One Kind of Learning. And he championed the idea, and this came out in the place versus response controversy that we heard about today. He championed the idea that there were different kinds of learning. But what happened then, historically what happened then, was that Frank Russell came up with a solution to the problem of that there are different kinds of learning, that place learning and response learning, according to Russell's solution, were not actually that different. It was just that the animal was using different kinds of cues. There was nothing fundamentally different about them. They just depended upon different cues. That was not what Tolman was saying. What Tolman said was that there were different kinds of learning that supported different sorts of behavioral strategies and hypotheses, and that these things might actually have different properties. That was an important point that got lost with Russell's solution. But Russell's solution, I think it was a 57 paper, is that right? You might remember. It was something in the 50s. That kind of put the story to bed for a while. So people stopped arguing about is it place learning versus response learning, and they sort of decided it doesn't matter. It's just a question of what kind of cues they're learning. Now we know that's absolutely wrong. That those two kinds of learning depend upon very different brain systems with rather different properties. They interact, of course. They're all part of the same brain. They may compete.
Different types of learning can exist in the same brain, and that was
for sure.
But that was the thing that he was fighting. Was
right.
This is kind of, we're seeing, like, looking back now. 2020 is, you know what I mean. But we're looking back and being like, wow, they're fucking dumb. How did you not know that this was real? And this is kind of, he's establishing Tolman. And Tolman is the dude who really got this idea moving with his, he'll explain it.
But we're still seeing the scars of what he's combating in today's public education. Like, we're still seeing that training scar.
For sure.
Interesting, dude.
Compete with each other, they may cooperate with each other, but they are different, and they have different properties. So that was a very important insight on Tolman's point, on Tolman's part, Russell's so-called solution. Another point that came up this morning, so Tolman was very interested and was one of the first to demonstrate this notion of latent learning. And here, the key point here was the big debate in the 1950s about the role of reward in learning and whether or not learning could happen in the absence of reward and reinforcement. And the discovery in the late 40s, early 50s, not discovery is the wrong word, but the demonstration that curiosity and exploration can motivate animals to do stuff. You don't have to give them rewards, you can just give them access to something novel. And Tolman then focused on the fact that animals will learn about the environment in the absence of any extrinsic motivation, in the absence of any, intrinsic motivation. No, you don't have to be hungry, they don't have to be thirsty. They do need to be those things, perhaps, to show you that they've learned, but they don't need to be like that to actually learn. And this came out this morning in some of the experiments on latent learning. So here again, Tolman was focusing on the role of curiosity and exploration, which most psychologists at that point were saying was unimportant. Right? Finally, there was this point about means and readiness, this sort of...
I feel like that point he just made is so... It just follows that trail of things that I've been talking about with, like, with the basic human needs, right? Like, you don't have to... What he's saying is basically, like, new shit makes you want to do shit.
Yeah, but I love what he said, that it needs to be hungry or thirsty or something to show you that it's learned. That implication, I feel like, is what these tests are showing as well, with these projections, with these things where it's scanning its environment. And then, fuck, dude, like our last video where it talks about the reverse order of thought of those synapse fires as it's laying down, as it's sleeping. So it's mapping what it did, what it could do, all these things. But that, I really like what he said there. That's
Agreed.
Very interesting to me, is that they, I don't know, as far as like a leadership quality, is like you have to be able to have a testable environment of knowledge. You have to. Or at least that's what we've been so predisposed to buy into. I don't know. I really like that.
For sure.
Significant, the notion, but what was buried in this idea was that Tolman was trying to get to the concept of expectation. How do animals seem to show you that they are expecting something? And the Tinklepaw experiment, love that name. I always tell my students about that. It's one of the great experiments simply because of the name of the experimenter. That Tinklepaw experiment showed quite profoundly that those, and it was talked about this morning, but basically, chimp is trained, I'm going to give you a very short version of it. A monkey is trained for a reward of bananas, and then after getting these bananas is suddenly given some lettuce and is pretty upset. Right? There was a better controlled experiment than that, but that's the point. Showing that animal was expecting bananas. Right? It wasn't just good enough to give it some food, it actually had a specific expectation of something. So those expectations mean that the brain is kind of a predictor. It's predicting what is going to be happening. That, of course, you can't open up a neuroscience book now without seeing the predicted brain all over.
And this goes to everything that we've talked about PTSD, and you begin to simulate all of these negative experiences that you've been habituated to, or that you've over and over and over and over, that you've done these things. And like one of the key things that I learned in therapy, or like my therapist told me, was that relationships are just expectation management. And I've never, nothing in therapy has been like more true than that to me.
Yeah.
because if I expect her to do this and she doesn't do it, I get upset. Well, maybe I shouldn't have fucking expected it.
Right.
You know what I mean?
And but that takes a lot of mental discipline to get out of. That takes a lot, dude.
For sure. Yeah, I feel like
It's a hard one.
Alan Watts and the whole Eastern religion idea of watching your thoughts or watching the smallest thing that happens and becoming more and more aware of what you are. Because Descartes puts us in a black hole, right? That whole idea puts you in a black hole of like, all right, well, I'm trapped in here. Well, what's happening in here? Everything out here doesn't mean shit anymore. Everything in here is what's important. So, like,
Right.
what the fuck is actually happening in here? And when I see this, I mean, everybody kind of associates it with the Matrix, but when I see whatever bit array on this two-dimensional thing outside of me, why is that triggering this thought inside of my head? What about that is telling me this? Or why am I doing this?
Right.
all over the place. But Tolman was one of the first to point out how important this was, that animals are engaging in constant predictions and expectations being generated out of these maps that they have built up. Right? So those four ideas are what leads to what, essentially. Before I say 2 words about how those ideas became the basis of the book that O'Keefe and I wrote, I just wanted to again point out, and this came out this morning, that there was in Tolman this clear connection between science and politics. So when he talked about these narrow strip maps and broad comprehensive maps, this was almost shorthand for him, I think, to say narrow-minded people versus broad-minded people, right? And that there are circumstances, brain damage being one thing and drugs and all that other being another. But stress, emotion, frustration, the things that Lucy was pointing out, all of those things can actually shift the brain so that it is, you might say, behaving more on the basis of a narrow strip map than on the basis of a comprehensive
survival.
And we now know, there's now good data to show exactly how that happens. That stress, that the hippocampus is loaded with stress receptors, and stress can kind of selectively downregulate the hippocampus and leave other structures in charge of behavior, and those other structures are more, you might say, survival-oriented and less exploration, curiosity.
That's fucking awesome.
Oriented, narrow your focus, stay alive, and so on. So again, Tolman was onto something very important.
So when we come back from deployments or when we've lived this lifestyle, our hippocampus starts to fucking shut down and these other things start to kick on to keep us alive.
Right.
To literally keep us alive.
So that's very cool, dude, because I don't know if you remember, and I'm not sure if we talked about it on a podcast. I think we might have. Where I had started to kick around the idea that part of your brain is growing. It's becoming more conditioned and stronger, and that explains the suffering to the other systems. It's the polar fucking opposite, and that totally makes sense.
Yeah.
That totally makes sense when you start to think about your prefrontal cortex, your deception, or excuse me, your decipher mechanisms of your surroundings are more now predisposed to a survival.
Yep.
Oh fuck, dude, that's sick.
Because I
science
feel like
is
we
dope.
have, I feel like we have a little bit more information than the
Right.
lay person because of that one. I'll link him.
It's key.
Yeah, I can't remember what the fuck his name was, but he
Here, I'll
tells
pull up
you
his-
what the fuck each one of these structures does in the limbic system.
Yeah.
And depending on the circuit, how high it is up on the circuit is which one comes first.
Robert Sapolsky.
Sapolsky, yeah.
Yeah.
And he basically says the exact same thing with the amygdala and fear response, and I can't remember what the other one was. It may have been the hippocampus, but I want to say it was something else.
Tonight I feel sticky, dude. Everything that's being said right now, I'm trying to grab it. Because that feels profound, dude. That makes so much sense to think that all of your other systems pick up the slack.
Mm-hmm.
They take that charge.
But do you remember when everybody was talking about the boog and
Yeah, oh yeah.
So we were just talking about The Last of Us, and the reason I don't want to fucking ruin the first episode. Actually, I can't do that to you. I can't do that to you.
Okay.
I might have to, but I can't.
You can. I'm not a big fucking
TV
woe
show.
is me
Okay.
for spoilers, bro.
Well, in the first, this is a spoiler. If anybody hasn't watched it, I'm about to spoil the fuck out of it. But in the boog, most of us in the army, as fucked up as this is going to sound to lay people or civilians, we want the world to end because we all have this grandiose idea of becoming fucking warlords.
Mad Max.
Yeah, we think we would be the fucking warlord. We have so much hubris, you know what I mean? But it's a little bit more than that. It's not like because the traditional leftist, or like how leftists are described, would call us like bloodthirsty or blood hungry or warmongers. That's not the thing. It's that in our mind we were the best that we are ever going to be and ever were in those moments, and in that lifestyle we were the best that we were ever going to be. But in The Last of Us, within the first fucking 5 minutes of the world going to shit, this dude's daughter gets shot and dies in his hands.
Damn.
And me, you, and Vici talked one time. It's like, how does a single person? I've heard a civilian say this. He said, "You can't trust people without kids because they have nothing to live for." And I was like, "Damn, true."
Fuck.
True. I was like, true.
Yeah. Ooh.
And
Interesting.
so that whole survival idea, you hear people talk about it too when they say we should go back to these simpler times, and we should go back to this, and we should go back to this. It's like, come on, you're not growing, bro. Like, America is dope, and most people in other countries, people who say that everybody hates America and don't say the other half of it have never left America.
Amen, dude.
You know what I'm saying?
Amen.
Because every time you go outside of America, they're like, some of these places literally think money grows on trees, bro. I met a dude
shit.
I met a dude in the army from I want to say he was from Nigeria, and he's like, bro, when I was growing up, we used to think money grew on trees out here. Like, this is fucking Atlantis to half the world.
Right.
And
Yeah.
you want to go back to farming, bro? I'm not trying to do that.
Well, it's the same people that have AC in their cars and fucking automatic heat from natural gas in their house or
Facts.
electric heat
Facts.
that are the ones saying, "I wish we lived in a simpler time."
Yeah.
It's like, no, you don't even know what simple means. Go hunting. Go spend a weekend out there, bro. One weekend, and tell me what you miss.
The reason it's cool is because you get to come back.
Yeah.
To come
It's
back.
like, this is temporary, bitch. You know the fucking turkey comes out of the oven, like, you know.
Yeah.
So it's all fine and dandy when you know you get to be warm again.
And the scary part, like, subjectively for us, is that when you're in this mode of thought or this modality, you can't see outside of it. And this map is so fucking tunnel vision that there's everything that I'm saying right now is Spanish to somebody in that mode.
Well, they're viewing you, or viewing this type of a conversation, as stupid. This is pointless. Like, I could live, dude. I could make it, bro. I don't need the AC. It's just nice to have.
Yeah, you could.
You don't know a life without it, pussy. Like, you don't.
But this is my next point. Is okay. Yeah, let's say we all go back. Then what's the point of doing what are we doing? Are we building towards something, or are we just all living?
Well, like, are
Surviving?
you?
What are we doing?
I've never met a person who is conservative in comfort that has nothing.
Say that again.
Ever. I have never met a person who is conservative in comfort that has nothing.
Maybe say
Everyone
it
who has
differently.
nothing wants to be progressive in comfort. They want to be more comfortable.
Yeah.
They do not want... They're like, no, my fucking sheet is fine in -3. It's fine.
Yeah.
Said no one ever, dude. Like, there's no.
Except for
fucking
Goggins or whatever his name is.
Right. Like, you want the world to be simpler, yet I guarantee you have a fucking nice big blanket for when it's cold. Get rid of it. You're not going to be conservative when you have nothing. In a comfort sense. I'm not meaning politically.
Yeah.
Important onto the differences between these sort of brain states that legitimate different forms of behavior. Right? So all four of those kind of notions, including this one. And one thing I do want to point out, this right here. See this by an overdose of repetitions on the original? What he's saying here is that when you overtrain an animal, it becomes a Hullian stimulus response animal. And we now know that that's true, and we now know the neuroscience behind that. When you overtrain animals, that the striatum begins to take over control of the behavior. There's a whole raft of experiments buried in that idea. So this quote alone probably has 6 or 7 PhD dissertations, buried in it, or could have, probably did.
Can you
All right, so
further
this was a book
explain
that
that
I
part?
wrote in '78, which sort of
Say that again?
Can you further explain what he just said?
About the stimulus response thing?
Like, overtraining an animal does what to it?
He's basically saying that another part of the brain will take over behavior, and it basically means that it's becoming automated. It's not super complicated. It's
Okay.
the same like muscle memory argument that we all know and love. Right?
Understood. Copy all. Automated was a good word for it.
idea. So this quote alone probably has 6 or 7 PhD dissertations, buried in it, or could have, probably did. All right, so this was the book that O'Keefe and I wrote in '78, which sort of built on, and it had a couple of key concepts.
This is what
Amongst
you've
the
been
key
reading?
concepts
Yeah.
was this one. Of course, this book
It's tough.
was written based on the discovery by O'Keefe of place cells. And it was that discovery that sort of triggered our thinking about this theory that led to all of the other work and everything that's come since then, I would say. So, well, not everything, but the spatial story, so to speak. So the 4 key concepts in the book. The first one in the title is that it's all about cognitive maps, and these are a special kind of spatial system, right? Second key thing, that the mapping system was one kind of memory system, responsible for one specific kind of information, and that multiple memory systems support various behaviors. That's a misprint there. Various behavioral strategies. So this again builds on Tolman's idea that there was more than one kind of learning, and we really insisted on this notion that these different kinds of learning have different properties, and that those different properties help us understand what you see when an animal has damage to the hippocampus or when a person has damage to the hippocampus. Third point, we said very, very explicitly maps are created during exploration. So we bought completely into Tolman's insistence that these cognitive maps, that what is the reward for an animal in generating a cognitive map was finding out about the world. It was not food, it was not water, it was not safety, although all of those things you might find out about in exploring the world, but those were not the motivations in any simple sense. It was simple curiosity to map the environment, and exploration was a key. So in the book, a chapter on exploration was the first chapter in discussing the actual data about the effects of hippocampal lesions. Right? And finally, that maps enable flexible behavior. We made the argument that if you have a map, just like if you have a map of San Francisco, it doesn't tell you, where you are. It simply tells you if you're here and you want to get there, this is what you do. Right? So a map sort of enables flexibility of behavior because it's such a rich information base, rather than just if I'm here, turn left at the corner. That was going to get you to where you get to if you turn left, but it's not going to tell you anything more than that. So those were the 4 ideas, or some of the main ideas conceptually in the book. I'm not talking now about the physiology of the place cells. These were the sort of theoretical conceptual ideas. And the point is, each one of those is one of the ideas that, here's Tolman's idea, and here's how it maps onto the things that we said. So we really did build extensively on Tolman's thinking, not only about the idea of a cognitive map, but about the properties of cognitive maps, about the properties of place learning, and how that informs behavior. So, I will close. I'm staying on time, I think. We made a variety of predictions in the book. One of those predictions was if this thing was really a cognitive map, then not only would it need the place cells that O'Keefe and Descartes had described, but it would also need something that conveyed information about direction and distance at a minimum, if it was going to function like.
Do you remember what we talked about the last time?
Yeah, the circular nodes,
Head direction cells.
head direction cells.
Head direction cells weren't discovered until 83, and this book was put out in 78. Or the place cells were discovered in 71. This book was put out in 78. 5 years later, they find what they just predicted.
Talked about.
No, they predicted. No, they predicted it. In the book, they're like, we predict such and such. For this to work, this is the next thing that needs to happen, or that these things need to be there.
So there was built into this the prediction that sooner or later somebody's going to find cells that provide direction information, and those head direction cells came. When did Ronk discover the head direction cells? The mid 80s, and then the final, and in many ways the cement piece, the grid cells that Edvard and Maj-Britt Moser discovered. And so you're going to hear about those and hear that aspect of the story from Edvard as soon as I get out of. Well, not as soon as I get out of the way, because the first talk by David Foster will be about this issue, about the hippocampus generating predictions. And we talked about that in the book for the reasons I described them. But again, we didn't know anything about the mechanisms, even though actually John was, I believe.
So that person that he just was talking about was the video that we watched at the end of the last video. So we've already seen him talk about those predictions, and that prediction is like when the place cells are generating forward.
I believe the first person to notice the ripples, and I think there's a mention in the book about the
wave ripples.
but we had no idea what they were, right? And now we understand that there are mechanisms in hippocampal activity that have to do with what's actually going on when an animal is predicting. What if I go down this road? What am I going to see? And so on and so forth. So that talk, now let's finish this. So David Foster will tell you more about that particular part of the story. So with that introduction to kind of where, sort of how O'Keefe and I built on the cognitive map story, and then lots of other really exciting things happen, and we're going to hear about those exciting things now from people who have actually done the work. So I'm going to get out of the way and let you introduce David.
So, we are going to go back and do before we get to the thing that he was just talking about grid cells, we're going to go back and talk about place cells. So this is 10 place cells that are being recorded in this fucking rat. And, yeah. So each color is a different cell.
Got it.
And this is how it's covering the entirety of this environment, and it's mapping. This is the map in so much sense, like the EM map, and this is the heat map of like where these things are firing.
But I thought I would just show you what one of these cells looks like.
So this person talking is John O'Keefe. He's the other person who wrote that book with the other speaker that we just listened to.
Okay.
But I thought I would just show you what one of these cells looks like. So here's an animal again. We'll
Whoa.
watch where the cells
That is not
are.
what
And every time the cell fires, we represent the animal's head and direction of pointing. So as you see, as it goes around, it drops these arrows here, and at the same time, there's a summed arrow representing the overall representation of distance. And what you can see is that most of these arrows are pointing in the north or north, slightly northwest direction. The cells are representing the animal's heading within the environment, irrespective of where it is in the environment. There is happy fire here as the other. These cells are found in an area just between the entorhinal cortex here and the hippocampus, and they're called head-directing cells. One of the interesting things about these, it looks as though this whole system is wired together to a polar coordinate system, which the animal can use wherever it is in the environment to tell the direction of head.
So those were the cells that they were predicting to be seen, and they found them.
Okay, so is there a reason why the majority of those hits on the waves were forward-facing, or that north? I'm not sure if it's the true north. But is there something that defines why, instead of my natural disposition would have been that the head direction cell to map an environment would almost evenly distribute the cardinal directions?
This is just one cell.
So here's an animal again.
Oh, copy. Okay, so this isn't
just,
a full
no,
cognitive relay.
This is just one fucking cell, and it's
Or north, slightly northwest direction. The cells are representing the animal's heading.
Because I don't think there's a single arrow that fires down. Now, granted, like there's one facing that western side.
But so this is the other thing, and this in the next video they kind of talk about the problem with this type of science and how it's not as precise as we would want it to be, but it's not so imprecise that it's meaningless. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because when you're talking about neurons and however big these fucking neurons actually are, whatever micro, macro, centimeter, whatever the fuck the term is, how tiny it is, it's hard to tell. He talks about it in here. It's hard to tell spatially which one is firing and which one you're looking at.
Okay.
Based on
fair
the
enough
area where it is.
Because you're more or less probably able to see a cluster comparatively to a singular.
So what he describes here in, was it this video or the other one? They put this fucking prism, right? This glass prism in between the cerebellum and this other part of the brain, and it was like flat straight on the entorhinal cortex, where they could then be able to see hundreds of these fucking cells and be able to be way more accurate about the way that. But this is science that's happened in the last 20 years versus 60 years ago.
Sure.
Started. So this is at the beginning of around the year 2000. The question we asked then is, now that there is such a signal deep in the brain in a way, how could this be generated? Because this is not something that is extracted from the outside
It's talking
world,
about
senses,
place cells.
not from a single sense at least. Yet there is such a clear correlate to the external world. So how is it made? And one of the ideas that were around in around year 2000, a little bit before, was that some of the signal might actually be generated in the hippocampus. So this is a hippocampus of a rodent, could be a rat or a rabbit. This is a transection through the hippocampus, shows the subfields of the hippocampus with the dentate, CA3 and CA1 here. And most of the place cell activity had been recorded in CA1, which is in a sense the last stage through this loop of the hippocampus before CA1 then projects out again. And then the idea was that these signals could then be generated in the hippocampus in the earlier stages of the hippocampus. So for that reason, an obvious thing for us to do was to inactivate chemically with lesions these earlier parts of the hippocampus, the CA3 area, and then record in CA1, and then see if the signal disappeared, or at least lost much of its quality.
So this is what it was talking about before, where early in the circuit, if you cut it off, does the signal still get there?
Right.
When that lesion was made here and be recorded in the subsequent stage. And what we found, somewhat to a surprise, was that that lesion actually didn't really have much of an effect. So this shows just the placement of electrodes here in the CA1 there. And this is the lesion. You see that the CA3 area is gone. And this is the result, 7 different cells recorded from this animal. And you can see that they still have pretty much a spatial activity, suggesting that perhaps this intrinsic loop of the hippocampus wasn't all that important in producing the place cell signal. And if it wasn't, what were the alternatives? Well, either it was all made in the CA1 itself, which for various reasons we did not think it was very likely, or there must be a strong spatial signal coming from the outside. And outside means the entorhinal cortex, because the main cortical input to the hippocampus is from the area called entorhinal cortex. So that
This goes back to Sapolsky, where he just said that the main input is from this other place. So the
Right.
main input to the hippocampus is from the entorhinal cortex. And Sapolsky says that in the order of hierarchy, the thing first is the most important, or prime is the prime.
motivated us to go out of the hippocampus and into the entorhinal cortex. This is now in 2004, and I show you another video, which is a recording from another
The ship
box
blew my
similar.
fucking
Rat is
mind.
walking around, and now the dots here are the positions where a single entorhinal cell is firing in the medial entorhinal cortex. And you can see that this cell fires in many places. So it's not quite like a place cell in the hippocampus, but yet there are discrete places, so it's not random, so it's position related, but the cell has multiple firing positions, and you can then see that, that as we play the video, those positions become much clearer. And another thing you will notice is that the distance between these fields is somewhat more regular than you would expect by chance. There's some regularity in this pattern. We didn't quite understand what that regularity was in the beginning, but then as we started recording in bigger environments, that became clearer. So this is now an environment that is 220 by 220 centimeters large. That's pretty much for a rat. It takes a while to cover it. So the gray trace here is the part of the animal, so you can see it has visited essentially every place in the box. And then the black dots are the positions where that single cell fires. And you can see that this is indeed a very regular pattern. To help you see the pattern, I have in this other example here just put red lines on top of it, and you can see that it's a repeating triangular or hexagonal pattern that stretches all over.
That raw image is near God, like a Rorschach chessboard. Like, that's insane. That it. So when we originally talked about that portion of it, I didn't realize how like significant that pattern is right out of the gate.
Yeah.
Fuck, dude, it's really specific.
Just wait.
The available space.
Just
So this
wait.
hexagonal pattern is like a grid that stretches all over the space, and for that reason we call them grid cells. So now these grid cells then turned out to come in different varieties. So they varied at least along 3 different dimensions. One is the phase of the grid cells, so that's illustrated here for 2 cells. One grid cell is shown in green and the other grid cell in blue, and you can see that they are shifted in XY plane. So this is one way that grid cells could differ, that they're simply shifted relative to each other. Or their scale might be different, as you see here. So there's the blue cell and the green cell have a different scale. The blue one has a much wider spacing and bigger fields. The green one has a smaller spacing and smaller fields. And the third way they could differ is the orientation of the grid. So you see 2 examples here that are slightly tilted relative to each other. So that's a third way to differ. So all of these variations were present in the data right from the beginning, and it turned out that some of them were also organized in anatomical space. So I'll briefly review that before I go over to the new stuff. So let's take the phase of the grid first. So this shows to the left here 3 different grid cells recorded at the same time: a blue one, a red one, and a green one, cell 1, 2, and 3. And you can see that they have these cells all recorded on the same electrode, so in the same place. They have different phases. They're shifted in the XY plane, and already these 3 cells cover most of the available space. As you can also see here, the crosses here are the peaks of each of the firing fields. So this is somewhat similar to what in the visual cortex field for orientation selective cells is often called salt and pepper organization, just meaning that it's completely scrambled. So that neighboring cells that are on the same electrode, neighboring in brain space, are not necessarily neighbors in the external space. It's apparently quite random.
So here is the difference between these and the head direction cells, because the head direction cells in brain space are localized and they form a ring. With grid cells, it's more, they sit, like you said, salt and pepper in the same
Almost
places.
random.
Yep. Except it's not random.
This random organization differs from the organization of the spacing of the grid, because when it comes to spacing, it seems to be much more structured. So this is a brain section in a rat. This is the hippocampus, so it looks like an ear here. And the red area here is the medial entorhinal cortex, where the grid cells are. And what you can see illustrated here is that as you start at the dorsal end at the top here, most or nearly all grid cells have a small scale. I mean, they have a high frequency, so the grid fields are very close to each other. Then as you go further down, deeper into the brain, the scale generally increases and gets bigger and bigger. And at the bottom here, the distance is at least sometimes several meters between each of the fields.
So at the bottom, the scale is bigger. Like, it covers more space. And then as you go up in anatomical space, like brain space, like vertically, It gets smaller and smaller and smaller.
So, is this a continuous gradient, what you see here? Is it a continuous change from small scale to bigger scale? And then that answer to that is probably no. It's a discrete organization. So that most or nearly all grid cells have a small scale when they have a high frequency, so the grid fields are very close to each other. Then as you go further down, deeper into the brain, the scale generally increases and gets bigger and bigger. And at the bottom here, the distance is at least sometimes several meters between each of the fields. So, is this a continuous gradient, what you see here? Is it a continuous change from small scale to bigger scale? And then that answer to that is probably no.
What he said, because his accent's kind of hard, he asked, would the scale be a gradient? Like, would it just slowly go up? And the answer is no, it does not.
It's a discrete organization. So that we can now say because we have recorded many grid cells from the same animal. So this is an example with 50 cells approximately from the same animal, but others go up to almost 200 grid cells. And when it is possible to record so many grid cells from the same animal, then one can ask if there is a relationship between their position along this dorsal to ventral axis, the steps axis, shown here on the x-axis, and the scale of the grid, which is then the distance between the fields. And what you can see is that, yes, there is an increase in the scale of the grid as you go deeper into the brain. However, this is not a continuous gradient in an individual animal. Instead, there's a step-like increase where you begin with the smallest size, is around 40 centimeters between each field. Then you introduce a second level, about 50 centimeters here, and then a third level after a while, and then finally fourth level at more than 100 centimeters, and probably as you go even further, more steps. So they overlap, but you can see they are quite discrete, and in that sense support the concept of a modular organization, and also what Lynn said, the idea of multiple scaled maps as Tolman had introduced. What's quite interesting about the modules is actually that if you now label these as M1, M2, M3, and M4, and then ask what is the scale relationship, and you ask that by taking M2 divided by M1, or take M3 and divide it by M2, or M4 divided by M3, to see what is the scale ratio from one step to the next, you find that that is actually quite constant. So this shows the relationship for M2 to 1, 3 to 2, and 4 to 3 for all recordings in all modules of approximately 14 animals. And the crosses are the averages. So you can see that despite some spread, the average is pretty constant, fluctuating from 1.40 to 1.43. So that means that as you go from the smallest grid module here, then you get to the next one by multiplying on average by 1.42, and then you go from the second one to the third one by again multiplying by 1.42, and then multiply by 1.42 again to get the fourth, and so probably so on. So that this is like a geometric progression where you just multiply by the same scale factor at each level. What would be the advantage of organizing the scale map in such a way? Well, I mean, here we can only speculate, but there has been attempts by, especially by Mattis et al. There's Andreas Hertz group in Munich, who are statistical physicists who have tried to find out what is the advantage of doing it this way, and then claim that this is the optimal way to organize the grid map if you want to represent space with a maximum resolution and a minimum number of cells. So finally, then I just want to say that also the orientation has some organization in an anatomical space. So this shows 3 grid cells with different orientations. You can see the lines here are different in the 3 cells, and they are recorded simultaneously. So that means that also the orientations differ. And if you focus on the left plot here, you see orientation plotted on the x-axis and the spacing of the cell on the y-axis. Each circle is one cell, and you can see that they tend to cluster. So the clusters are as expected based on the modular scale organization. You have the smallest one here at 40, and this one at 50, 60. Second one at 80, and then some further up. But as you can see, the organization of the clustering of space is accompanied by clustering of orientation, so that cells, that grid orientation is co-modular with grid scale. That means that if there is a change in the scale of the grid, there's also a change in the orientation, usually.
It's modulated, bro. So certain parts are only this, and then other parts are only this, and computationally, that's fucking huge.
Gigantic.
Anything you want to say right here, or just keep trucking?
I'm almost like fucking appalled that it's always so geometrically perfect. Like, no matter how far we've gone down, it remains, fuck, dude, for lack of better terminology, unified.
Geometric
like this
unity.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Weinstein. Fuck, man, like, there's something there. There's something to be said for that. That those steps are even for the most part.
Yeah.
I don't know if more data would even provide even like a further zeroing of that variability. I'm sure it would.
Together. So I'll skip the right one, but just say that, this is just to remind myself that now we have these 4 modules of grid cells, 4 independent groups or clusters of grid cells, probably a few more that we have not detected, and experiments that I do not have time to show, but are published, show also that these modules can actually respond independently to changes in the geometry of the environment. So they are sort of semi-independent and can do their own things to a large extent. Okay, so this is just a slide to remind me to tell you that although there are differences between the modules, within the modules, this is a really rigid map. So that if you now look back to the map I showed you, the green and blue and red cells, the phase relationship that these cells maintain, illustrated here by the relationship between blue, red, and green, is maintained as you go to a different environment.
Unlike place cells, where they can change.
Right,
Place
this
cells,
is
this is every time, every place.
this is the SOP
Yes.
of cognitive mapping.
Yep. This is the substrate. This is where everything is built off of. This is it.
Gross. Dude, Jesus fuck, dude. That's insane.
Square box, for example, so same relationship, or to a different room even. So this
It even has the same dead space.
I will not spend time on showing you the data, but it's really a universal, in a sense, or a rigid map that is applied over and over again in whichever environment you go, which is completely different from what you see in the hippocampus, where you have many maps that apparently are randomly are as orthogonal to each other or as uncorrelated as possible. So that gives the hippocampus a huge capacity for storing maps, but the entorhinal map is really a single map that is applied over and over again in every place you go. And finally, to complete the introduction, then these cells coexist with other cells. So head direction cells have been mentioned several times. Jim Rank found them in '85. These are cells that fire only. They do not really have a spatial firing field, but they fire in whenever the head of the rat is pointing in a certain direction. So 2 different experiments here. The same cell fires only when the rat looks in the left direction here, or for this cell in the upper left direction. And they, again, also coexist with another type of cell that we observed in 2008, intermingled with grid cells, which we call border cells. Similar cells were found in the subiculum by the O'Keefe group. And those cells fire specifically when the rat is at the borders of the environment. So this cell fires only when the rat is in the east wall here. You can stretch the box, still fires only in the east wall. Stretch it the other way, still fires on the east wall. And then you can even insert the cell, a wall, and it fires along that wall as well. So these cells really just fire along walls and define the borders of the environment.
What? So not only are you mapping a location cognitively, subconsciously, more than likely, is what I feel like this implication is.
Oh yeah, you're not conscious of most of this happening.
But you're also having an edge detectional feedback based on top of that map, and then you're also injecting a subjective nature on top of that through the place cells.
Yes.
Gross. Dude, that we can see this?
So, like, basically, for anybody who doesn't understand what just happened, which I had to watch like 16 of these over and over and over again. Basically, what this is saying is that if there is a wall, your brain has a cell that will fire relative to distance away from said wall or boundary to where you can't go there. And then you can map that. Like, you can hold that in your head holographically, for instance, that when I'm in a hotel room right now, and I can see through this wall over here where the bathroom is, and I can picture the fucking toilet. Right? If you at home, or you're looking around your house, like whatever the fuck you're staring at watching the screen, look through the wall. You can do that because you're able to do this. Mm-hmm. That's the only reason.
Now, I do think that this poses not only some like good meditation lines, but also questions, right? So, as far as cognitive growth over time, something that I've seen with like the kids now is that when a door is shut, they take it as a wall. Ergo, they will be loud behind that door. They'll screw off. They'll do whatever. Mm-hmm. It's like the brain has to not only identify that it is an edge, it is a barrier, but then you have to learn over time that some barriers still don't allot for like permanent ceasing of of life, right? So sound can still travel through that barrier, XYZ. So there's obviously some sort of developmental line that occurs, because like you're not going to scream in your hotel room right now,
No.
because you know there's someone on the backside right behind you and probably right in front of you too.
Yep.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's some sort of thought that has to occur with that, some sort of cognitive growth. But if you had your kids in there and they were playing, like they wouldn't be so mindful of like the audio travel through there, because their brain has already said that's a wall, that's a, you know, it's good.
I
The other like
I don't think kids even think that way though. I don't think they give a fuck
Maybe.
that there's a wall there. I feel like
I don't
that's
know.
you as an adult projecting your way of viewing the world.
Sure, like,
So,
privacy.
the kids just want to play. You know what I'm
Right.
saying? But I do
Now-
think you're right. I don't think that they simulate the outside world outside of themselves.
Mhm.
But that's something in like Piaget's developmental model that's called like egocentric. Like
Mhm.
everything's about me.
Right.
And at some point they become altruistic, or like they begin to learn that other people exist in
Right.
the same way that I exist.
Independently of me, they exist.
Yeah.
The other question that I think it poses, though, that immediately came to me, and it's in reference to work, is that like in a lot of homes, there will be like a curtain placed over a half wall or through a threshold of a door, whatever, stapled up, maybe just dangling from the roof a little bit, whatever. But my brain automatically tags that as a barrier immediately, because my sight has ceased at that. Now, does that cell replace its fire as I tell myself, like, no, that's an opening, that's not a barrier, that's not a wall? And then if I remove that curtain, is there a differential now in, like, if I were to have a heat map of my own mental picture there, would that cognition evaporate in that line? That those cells are no longer augmented to that barrier?
So I think there's two different tasks that are happening there. I think one of them is computational.
Sure.
I think that what you're saying with if there's a sheet over the wall, my brain initially is going to fire that way, but then I'm going to use other cues to
Projection through that threshold and be like, well, no,
Yeah.
that's there to block, but it's not there to be a barrier. It's blocking sight or maybe heat, but it's not blocking my travel, the traverse through. I'm very curious, dude. I think the applications of this are bizarre, dude. I find myself, I'm still in such a mental trap of hardware that, like, this cell, if it's augmented to the barrier, it can't do anything else, and that's identifiably not true.
No,
Because
I
these
think
cells,
you're right. I think it. So this is, you have to remember how many neurons you actually have,
sure,
and what this is just one.
right?
And
This is augmenting one.
One thing is this is what it's doing, and then these other ones are doing this, and then all of these things together create what we understand as objective reality.
What I would love to see, though, and I know that this isn't something that we're probably going to be able to, but with like human trial or something with these types of testings, because if I go into a room, I see the walls, I detect those edges, I say, yes, these are the barriers to this environment. I'm now taken out of that environment and I'm told to think about that environment. Are those same cells going to occur? Are those same synapse fires going to happen? If I'm told to imagine that room, my knee jerk is yes.
Yeah.
Because it goes back to projection, that we already know the place cells can fire through an environment based on knowledge.
That's a
So
good point.
all those have to fire, right?
That's a good question about if you told me to imagine it, whether or not
Yeah.
those place cells still fire. I think that's kind of the implication of that, the end of our last video where the firing is going forward.
Right, but and then that also happens to us in the environment of, like, you and I briefly, I think even in the last video, talked about CQB and entering rooms and supposing or theorizing or assuming a threat is there. There is a projection occurring into that unknown that's saying danger, 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 like alarm bells are going off. And if I were to never kick that door, if I were to never go through that threshold, and I was only going to imagine what's over there, those same predictions, those same projections are going to be occurring. It's the verification or the negation of those ideas
Did you just
that
make
occurs through
Schrodinger's
that.
cat, bro?
I don't know.
It feels like you did just make Schrodinger's cat. If I never open the door, is it dead?
Oh yeah, no, for sure, dude. I mean, I'm with that. Like, if I lock a cat in a box, it's quantum now.
Yeah.
That cat is quantum, bro.
Both alive and dead at the same time.
Yeah. That's funny, bro.
So that means we have several types of cells intermingled with each other in the entorhinal cortex. We have the grid cells, we have the head direction cells, we have the border cells, and then in the hippocampus we have the place cells. So how much is this unique only to rats and maybe mice? No, it's not. So they are been found across a number of mammalian species. So interestingly, particularly in bats. So why bats? Bats are not they are not related to rats. They're actually on their own branch of the evolutionary tree. They have been reported in monkeys and in humans recently, so that most likely grid cells exist throughout at least most or many mammalian species. So whether they exist outside the mammalian kingdom, no one knows, but I mean, we haven't really not even known where to look. But anyway, I mean, they are widely expressed and probably originated at least early in mammalian evolution.
Is this president
that brings me
non-mammals?
to three topics that I want to touch in the second part.
Oh,
of
he
my talk.
doesn't know.
So at the very first, I want to just introduce it by asking very, very briefly how can this grid
Reptiles.
pattern be generated. And this is too complicated to spend much time on it, but I do want to mention it because it motivates the first part of the results. So how
I
can we
wanna
get
know if it's
localized
universal.
activity in the brain network? There have been many ideas about that, and basically many of them have in common that they involve what is often called attractor networks or continuous attractor networks. Now, this is illustrated here. This is a neural network. Each dot is one cell, and these cells are organized in this diagram according to where in the box they fire. So imagine they are regular place cells for which this was first proposed. So the cells up here are located firing in the same part of the box, and those down here fire in the opposite part of the box. So the idea is that in such networks there are strong connections between cells that fire in the same locations, so they excite each other. That means that they can sort of keep each other active, and you get continuous or maintained activity simply by these cells having recurrent connections that make each other fire. Of course, there has to be a ring of inhibition around, otherwise this will spread out and completely drive the network to epilepsy. But this is one way you can produce such localized activity, and the idea in these models, suggested by several groups, and particularly for place cells by Samsonovic and McNaughton, is that the activity here can then be moved around in the network simply by adding input from that signals the animal's own motion, such as speed and direction input. And this can then be extended to grid cells. So I'll just try to conceptually illustrate that in such a network you can have many bumps of activity that's sort of self-maintaining, but if you have many of them, what will happen then is that they will start to compete with each other because they all have this ring of inhibition around them, so they will sort of push each other away as much as possible. And what happens if you have such activity bumps pushing each other away? Well, the equilibrium stage you will get, the point where it all will settle, is when you get the hexagonal pattern, because then they're all as far away from each other as you can get it. And this has been shown then in various computer simulations, that if you have cells in a network like this, where every single pixel is one cell that has an inhibitory area around itself, it will then develop into a hexagonal pattern.
So, so every cell, every pixel is a cell, and this one fires, and then around it inhibits the cells around it, kind of like
Sure.
a Minesweeper, where like
Right.
one, whatever. Those ones aren't allowed to fire, and then the next one fires, and then there's an inhibition around there. Is how
It feels like magnetism.
it does, and
It feels a lot like magnets.
We'll get to it later, but do you see how? I mean, I can say it right now because nobody's fucking watching this. But do you see how this lines? They're like straight lines, right?
Yeah.
They found cells even deeper than this that are straight lines, like this.
Yeah.
And then some of them are like this, which ends up looking like electromagnetic waves. So these EM waves are just stacking on top of each other, and where they cross is where these fucking grids cells start.
Fuck.
Do you see that?
Yes, dude. That
And the idea
is.
is then if you have such a hexagonal pattern, you can then
Insane.
drive it around by using these speed and direction signals that sort of move these bumps of activity in the network. So that brings me to my point. For these models to work, then you need these speed signals. There has to be information about the animal's own.
For all of this to work, there needs to be a fucking cell that tracks how fast you're fucking moving.
Motion coming into the entorhinal cortex to the grid cells. But is there such information? Well, I mean, we all know, it's known in the field that both place
Is
cells
that
and
part
grid
of the
cells are
head
slightly
cells?
modulated by speed and direction, so the information is there, but it's not really, really strong. So we decided to look more for it, and specifically we wanted to see if there are cells that not only encode the speed of the animal, but even in a linear way, because if it's linear, that means that the faster the animal walks, the higher is the firing rate. If there's a linear relationship between that, it would be so much easier to translate the animal's movement in the environment into a certain movement in the brain network. So, looking for these speed cells, shown here, what we did, this is Emilio Kropp's work. He made what we call a Flintstone car, which works in the way that the Flintstone car does. Namely, you walk in it, and then there's a barrier at the back and in the front, and the computer can decide what is the speed of this car, and we can then determine the speed of the rat and see whether cells actually respond to the speed of the car. And yes, they do. So these are some examples. The gray trace is the speed of the car, and the green is the speed is the firing rate of the cell. And you can see that there are several cells that have activity that really follow the speed of the car. And so this is a linear relationship, speed on the x-axis, firing rate on the y-axis. And then, having seen these cells in the Flintstone car, we then went back to the open field where the rat walked in the box here and asked, well, then these cells should be there as well. And we went into cells that previously just looked like noise. And so this is rate maps for these cells, 3 different cells. This is the box, XY, and then firing rate is shown in color. And you can see that these 3 cells really don't have any preferred firing regions in the box. However, if you now plot the firing rate, the firing rate is then is color. If you now plot that against the speed of the animal on the y-axis and the head direction on the x-axis, you can see that firing rate really increases as the speed of the animal increases. And that's also shown here. We have x-axis shows speed and y-axis shows firing rate, and you can see there's a linear relationship.
So now we have the head direction, and we have the speed at which we are moving in any given direction being tracked, and we have this grid that is being projected on everything around us.
Right.
Do you like that?
Holy shit. I mean, as I walk this thought simpler, I feel like it's like no shit. Like, of course, all of this is being tracked. But the sheer ability to see this type of science, this is fucking mind-blowing, dude.
Yeah.
It's very humbling. From a 21st century human perspective, this is for free, dude. Like, this is free.
Yeah.
We're just doing this shit. Bizarre. From a human, though, the idea that all of this exists and can more than likely and is manipulated by the nature in which you exist, it's fucking really terrifying, dude.
I definitely agree. For me, it's been mind-blowing, but then it's also been solidifying a lot of intuitions that I had about things after going to therapy.
Absolutely. I think that this definitely adds fuel to the fire that you've been burning for a minute now. It's blowing my nips off, though, dude. I'm falling to pieces over here.
Essentially what it shows is that the number of such cells is much larger than you would expect by chance if you just shuffle the data. And this just shows more such cells, actually 256 neurons we identified with a significant relationship between speed on the x-axis and firing rate on the y-axis. And you can see that it's nicely linear in all of these cells. And actually, you can even use those cells to predict the animal speed. So if you take simultaneously recorded speed cells, as we now call them, and in some animals we have at least 4 or 5 of them at the same time, you can very much, with a very high precision, predict what is the instantaneous speed of the animal. So the gray is the real speed of the animal as it's walking around, and the blue is the predicted speed based on those cells. So this is as you would expect if you actually have cells that strongly correlate with the speed of the animal. These cells are not, they are distinct from other cells. This is shown here. So this is a plot where every circle here is one
So I'm going to
cell.
turn it down a little
And
bit
then on the
because
x-axis, we've got
this
spatial
stuff
information,
starts
and on the y-axis,
talking
directional
about stuff
information.
that's really not
Both of these
important,
correspond.
but there's
And
about
then
to
what
be
you
a
can see
part
here is that,
that's...
and these cells are then classified
I
according to
personally
the criteria.
don't fucking understand the math when they're talking about this stuff now. From this point forward, I don't have any fucking idea how they're doing this math. But everything before this, I kind of can get like a little bit of a grasp of it. I'm like holding on to my fucking kite. I'm like, all right, I'm following, and then I lose the fucking kite, and they're just telling me what's going on.
Is intermingled among the grid cells and the head direction cells, and it's about 10% of the cells, which is not bad actually. And finally, just this shows that these cells, a speed cell in one environment is also a speed cell in another environment. So these are two different environments, A and B.
Relative.
And you can see for these four simultaneously recorded cells that have exactly the same speed versus rate profile in all of them. And you can actually use the speed relationship in environment A to decode the animal speed in environment B, because the relationship doesn't care about the surroundings. You have the same correlation between speed and firing rate in all of the environments. Okay, I'll skip that. So that means that self-motion information is actually coming into the grid cell system, and that there is a specialized type of cell that encodes the speed and then provides the grid cells with the type of information they do need in order to update the grid map as the animal is actually moving around in the environment. Okay, then a little bit about the second type of finding. Because now we know that the self-motion information is important, but that's not enough, because for a grid cell to really be useful, it has to fire in the same place each time the animal comes back to the box.
So what it just said there is, I feel like, is super important. To be useful for navigation, grid cells cannot only respond to self-motion cues, i.e. head direction and the Flintstone car idea. They must also anchor to external reference frames. So this is where, in the beginning of this video, I had a really hard time tying everything back to Descartes. There was a real rough transition there to start this video, and thank you for not fucking calling me out on it. But the problem here for me with Descartes is nothing is real in Descartes. And then in most philosophy after that, in idealism, everything is just a thought. In skepticism, nothing can be known. But then Kant really tries to drive a point home that, well, we can know the external reality, and something inside of me is telling me that's true too, because how the fuck did we develop cars? How did we develop computers if this is all just my brain, right? How does anything new happen? You know what I'm saying? But this external reference frame, the biggest provider of that for me is that those boundary cells fire relative to barriers in our environment. So we know for a fact that walls are real and the ground I'm walking on is real, as far as we can understand what the word real means in this context. But
My counter to that, though, how much time have you spent in virtual reality?
a lot.
So those cells, all that shit'll fuck with you in VR heavy. Have you ran into the wall yet?
No.
Okay. So when you have those goggles on and you're standing in an arena, like I used to play this gladiator game in VR, right? And you'd be swinging your sword, doing this shit, and for you, your reality in that moment is that arena, right? All of your senses are replaced by that because you're having these visual audio cues based on your hand movements, head orientation, all that. And then you step too far and you run face first into the wall of your house. And I have never experienced that type of mental, like, you can feel the fireworks in your brain detonating.
This is the orienting principle, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, dude, because, like, in my reality right now, this is a clear field. And then in reality, in another one, I just ran into a solid object or punched my desk. Fucks your brain up real bad, dude. And then just to play devil's advocate for a moment, based on what you said, like, how can we invent cars and computers if it's just all our own brains, or your brain, for the example used? How much different is a car from what we know of ourselves in a human body? There's fuel inputs, there's pumps, there's systems.
True.
Right?
True. But how did we come up with that idea to begin with? How did we learn?
We
about
looked
the human
inside
body?
ourselves, right?
But this is the point. No, this is the point: is that there's something external to me.
I agree. I just to play devil's advocate to that principle, because like a computer thinks a lot. Like I regularly think of my own brain as a computer.
Oh, for sure. We're reverse
Because
engineering our brain.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so we're putting ourselves out into the world. So is the world external, or do we make ourselves external?
See, I don't. Descartes puts you in a point where everything external to you is not real. So that
Right.
means every human that I interact with is not real.
Right. Which I
Everything-
can't gravitate towards. I can't agree with that.
But to get out of Descartes, like, you have to be able to prove something. Like, that's what the
Right.
Cartesian skepticism is. And it's, well, how do I prove that anything other than me is real? Because his first principle is, I can think, therefore I am. I am aware that I am the thing that is doubting, so nothing else, what else am I, right? So then
Right.
from that point, it's like, okay, I can witness my own whatever in this environment where you're talking about a car isn't much different than a human body, and I agree with you. However, there has to be something building upon a body of knowledge, like the same way in the Army, doctrine is built over the years, and we're building on the mistakes of somebody else or the lessons that somebody else has learned. That means time is real. That means
Right.
things exist independent of me.
Correct.
And that is that is the most important way. That is the first way, or the first thing that you have to do to get out of Descartes, is to prove to yourself that things exist independent of me. And once you're there, it's like, well, how the fuck do I prove it? Because then you deal with these skeptics or these idealists who say, well, that's just your perception.
Yeah,
That's
it's
just-
making it. You're making it that way.
Yes, and it's like, whoa,
Yeah.
okay, does this can exist? Can you touch this? So
Yeah.
I'm not just doing this. You know what I'm
Right.
saying? And that's where this argument really starts for me, is like proving that there is something in between me and you. There is something that we are both experiencing at the same time. We may be perceiving it differently, but now it's okay. We have walls. All right, this is walls exist. The ground exists. The roof exists. Buildings exist. The physical barriers, like this physics engine, exists, and that's a part of like the basic. I'm just kind of calling myself out here about like childhood trauma, but that's like the basic development of humans is physics testing. Like you'll see babies hitting shit just because they can, just to see what the
Right.
fuck it does. You'll watch them drop shit just to see it drop, and then they'll do it again, and then that's us expecting things to happen, right? That's where this expectation and this prediction model comes. But even when you talk about science, the way our science works is that you can spend 30, however, if you had an infinite amount of time, the law of entropy is like that a human would reconstitute itself after you destroyed it. That all those bits would reconstitute itself at some point.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And that's kind of where we sit with physics. And that shit doesn't make sense on a daily basis. And that's kind of where the other skeptics take things. And what Kant was trying to do, just like Tolman was fighting against behaviorists, Kant was simultaneously fighting Christianity, but he was also fighting this skepticism that leads to just pure nihilism. That where if nothing else exists, what the fuck is the point of anything? If it's all just in my
Right.
head, then fuck everybody. I can just rape this girl, I can fucking beat the shit out of that dude, and nothing fucking matters.
Right.
So then there's this external reference frame now that Kant has securely put us in, but it's just a larger box that we now exist in. We're no longer trapped inside of our own head per se, but we all exist and Jung called it the collective unconscious. So
Yeah.
we all exist in this collective unconscious. And then even fucking Eric Weinstein, when he's talking about geometric unity, he calls it the pitch. And then there's the stands where everybody else is sitting, and then everything's kind of happening on this pitch. That is this cognitive map that we all are in, but we're all in our own one. And the images that are rasterized, we're getting a little further than we should, but that are rasterized around the wall are based on all of our experiences leading up to that event.
Right. Yeah, there is a reality. We just kind of perceive things through a render, through that overlay, through that point of reference. But very
useful.
interesting.
It has to fire in the same place each time the animal comes back to the box. And how can it do that? It has somehow to use the surroundings, like the walls and the ceiling and so on, to make sure that the grid fires at exactly the same spots each time. So there must be some anchoring taking place. With anchoring, we mean that the grid is associated with specific parts of the environment. How does that take place? So this begins with an observation we made that we first found really puzzling. And it's shown here. This is 4 different rats, a grid cell from each. And what you can notice is that the orientation of these cells from these 4 different rats is almost identical. So it's shifted the same way. And this was actually the case in every single animal. All the grids were oriented the same way. So we couldn't really understand that. So what Tor and Anne Stensola in our lab did was that they plotted the orientations of 587 cells, grid cells that had been recorded in a regular environment, a 1.5 meter by 1.5 meter box. So the way the plot was made is as follows.
How everything's forking into an apex?
Yeah. Look at...
in a triangular type motion?
It's aligning itself based on these corners. And then it's
oh, shit. I'm fucking stupid. You're absolutely right. It's literally taking, like, the primary cardinal directions other than immediate left, immediate right, but it doesn't need those.
So this is an autocorrelation map, just a similar map as you have seen. So we took the inner point, or the central point of the autocorrelation, and the 6 surrounding points in the grid. And then those 7 points, including the center here, was then plotted here for every single cell. And then those 7 points were put into that plot from all 587 cells. And what you now can see is that, since this is plotted in relation to the walls of the box, like this, you can see that those plots are certainly not uniformly distributed around. They actually line up, more or less, with the axis of the box. And in this case, they line up with the y-axis, the green axis here. So you can see that that the firing is around the y wall here, and then 60-degree multiples of that wall, whereas there's no firing along the x wall at all. That's just the same shown down here. You get partly the same when you do this also for a bigger box, 220 by 220 centimeters. But then the dots actually line up with both walls. But nonetheless, this is certainly not random. So this means that
are they still in
the
60-degree radius?
Is really important for deciding the orientation.
Is it still in a 60-degree spacing?
Takes one of its axes
something
and then lines
smaller.
it up with one of the walls. Not quite, because if you look more closely now, this is what you see. So this plot shows the orientation of the grid axis, the one that is nearest 0 degrees from one of the walls, and the number of cells that has that orientation. So this is an example that has an orientation of around 7 degrees maybe, which is actually very typical. So what you see now is that orientations of 0 degrees, meaning that the grid has a complete alignment with one of the walls, are almost absent. There's almost not a single cell that lines up perfectly with the walls. Instead, they are slightly shifted and have an average orientation of either plus 7.5 degrees or minus 7.5 degrees. And then it tapers off, and at 15 degrees, again, no cell, almost no cell at all. So this is strange, because that means that the grid cells actually do have preferred orientations. They avoid 0 degrees, they avoid 15 degrees, and they tend to line up around 7.5 degrees. So what does that mean? Well, there's something special about 7.5 degrees, and that is that in contrast to 0 degrees and 15 degrees, which are symmetric with the walls, 0 is symmetric in the sense that the symmetry axis is one of the walls, and 15 is symmetric, that the symmetry axis, now with an axis that is the diagonal of the box. But 7.5 is the least symmetric pattern you can get, in the sense that the grid is as far away from symmetric with any of the walls as possible. So that means that the grid pattern along the x wall and along the y wall is as different as possible. So that could be an advantage, because this would be a way that the rat could have different firing patterns along the 2 pairs of walls. And whether that means that it reduces the risk of mixing up places, that remains to be shown. So for now, I would just ask very briefly, what could be the mechanism of such? How can the grid cell sort of orient itself 7.5 degrees off the walls? Well, then I think part of the answer is that this 7.5 degree offset actually goes along with a deformation of the grid. And with deformation, I try to illustrate that here. I'm not
That's
sure
what I'm saying. All this math shit is,
but at least the point is that
this totally makes
the grid
sense.
pattern is very often not
Like,
perfectly hexagonal. It's usually
what
compressed
he's
in one
saying
or
with the
other
7.5
direction,
degrees
and,
is totally.
in this case,
He briefly says it and then moves right on past it. But for orientation purposes, like LandNav 101 of how to not get lost is to landmark where you are.
Mm-hmm.
Like to understand, okay, if I cross this hill will now be on this side of me. It'll be over this shoulder. I understand that. I'm able to reference it if I look behind me, whatever, right? So if you're in a perfectly boxed room and you're symmetrically viewing that room inside your head, all walls are the same fucking wall. But if you take an angle of 15, right, that's too far, that becomes symmetrical again. All walls are the same because all you've done is rotate that triangle by its own mathematics of angle, right? But if you half that, you form an asymmetry of the room. Because your primary mapping, if the majority of your cells are on this back wall, you understand that this wall is different than the wall across from you. Because you've predisposed more of that thought to that AO. That's so profound, and he just breezes right over that, and he's like, it might be a way that they're orienting, we don't know yet. It's like, no, that feels exactly what it's doing. But that feels exactly right.
Yeah, in order for them to make claims, though, they have to like do all of these.
100%. Like they have to disprove any alternative,
yeah.
Which is the hardest part. Like I'm just a moron in my bedroom. Like I can just say whatever and buy into it. But that totally makes sense to me. Is that if I'm in a perfectly, what they need to, I'm sure they have, and I'm just speaking as a uninformed child, but they should try rooms that are no longer symmetrical.
They have. And
show that. Yeah, I want to see that testing with the same type of angular analysis.
Well, I don't know. I haven't seen one of those yet, but I do know that
because if it
circle rooms.
Because there would see a circle's the same thing as a square though. Is that like I have to put my brain at an angle like how if you're in a perfectly square blank room, no furniture, no points of reference, how are you going to remember which corner is which? Mm-hmm. You have to orient your brain to do that.
Oh, I see what you're saying now.
Yeah. So if I'm thinking symmetrically in a perfectly blank room, I am going to be lost.
Yeah, then the grid cells are what's informing me where.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if I think of it as in an asymmetry, or I start to map it.
That's gross. I just watched how my brain. Oh, that's gross. That's so gross.
It is, dude. It's disgusting.
It's like the AI that's in control of this meat sack just saw what the meat sack is doing for it.
Oh, dude.
That's gross. That's so gross.
I don't see it myself, but it should be longer. It should be elliptic, so maybe you see it. It should be longer one way than the other, and that is very often the case. And usually, when there is such a 7.5 degree offset, the grid is also elliptic, and even more. The long axis of the ellipse usually it has a predictable relationship to the walls. It's shown here the orientation of the ellipse on the x-axis and the frequency of cells on the y-axis, and you can see it has 4 peaks with 90 degrees between them. So obviously related to the walls again. And then if you plot the orientation of the ellipse on the x-axis and the rotational offset of the grid on the y-axis, you can see that they tend to go together. So suggesting that this deformation and the rotational offset actually are parts of the same process. And this then brought us to ask what could be the interactions that actually create such a pattern. And then there is something in mechanics, in continuum mechanics, which is called shearing, which describes interactions with the borders here. So this is a grid pattern, just illustrates the concept. So this is a grid pattern, it's made now with square units just for simplicity. And if you apply these shearing forces that are strong along the walls and then reduce in magnitude as you go away from the walls, and then in this case have opposite directions in the two y walls, what you get is that this, if you apply such forces, what you get is both a deformation of the grid, so the circle then becomes elliptic, and at the same time as you apply these forces, you also get a rotation of the grid pattern. So the grid axis, you see them here, then you apply these forces, you also get a shift of the axis. So you get exactly what we have observed, and you can then reverse the whole thing by applying these shear forces in the opposite direction of what was probably applied, and you completely get rid of these 7.5 degree offset, and you get a peak around 0 degrees. And suggesting that these such shear forces may apply from the borders on the environment, and they decline as you get away from the walls, and then when such forces apply, you both get a deformation of the grid, and you get an...
Wouldn't that just be topology? Wouldn't that just be your brain rendering height?
So I'm not sure if he's speaking in 3 dimensions with this grid as of now. I'm taking this more as like exactly what we just said. Like what I'm taking what he's saying is that if you take this force and you see the elliptical, what they're doing is they're transferring that 7.5 asymmetry of analysis and making it 0 to gridify it.
What I'm understanding is that they're trying to explain why this elliptic pattern occurs, and it's coming from the shear force from the boundaries.
I need him to define shear force again.
I don't know.
I need him to define what that means, because if he's meaning the shear of like a cliff, like this is a sheer drop off, or is he meaning like shear as in like the detection of that barrier and the shearing inward?
Then brought us to ask what could be the interactions that actually create such a pattern, and then there is something in mechanics, in continuum mechanics, which is called shearing.
Continuum mechanics? Do you know anything about that?
No,
Yeah,
but if you analyze that, it's the persistence of mechanism. The you know what I mean, like the consistency of decipher. So that's what those words can mean. Like that's a thesaurus of it, right? So, fuck! What are you trying to tell me, buddy?
I don't. Bro. This part of I don't understand.
The problem is that his definition or this definition of shearing, I don't think is what I want to say. Like, am I shearing a sheep or is it a sheer cliff? Like, are we talking about the removal? The barrier removal? So moving away from it? Because he's got these arrows that are conflicting directions, and I'm not sure what those are trying to represent. The only thing that I can see in it is that if this side is the up arrows and this side is the down arrows, well, if I push these, then I offset my own mental map.
But
and that's how I'm taking this
I feel like
to
that's what
here.
you were saying earlier, though.
Exactly, and that's why I'm saying, like, is this just them taking this elliptical shape that's being produced by the 7.5 ratio and
what
making
if there's
it
an
0?
algorithm already being established here that your head direction cell tells the shearing force to do this wall and this wall, and then the other one does the other walls.
Right. And that's also a possibility, right? Is that this equation's the autonomy of it exists, so your head direction is making that decision for you. So instead of seeing your world as asymmetric, that room becomes symmetrical to you based on that. Like if this is how you're analyzing it, it's being deciphered as that,
Maybe.
as an even.
Like I said,
Fuck.
This part.
0 degrees. And I'm suggesting that these such shear forces may apply from the borders on the environment, and they decline as you get away from the walls, and then when such forces apply, you both get a deformation of the grid, and you get an...
See, when he uses the word decline there, I'm thinking both...
He's imagining height.
Yeah, both this, but also with magnitude.
But it's also the idea of just wave strength declination.
Yeah, that's
so
what
it's
I mean,
the ups
magnitude.
and coming down.
I feel like it's topographic, but it's both at
so I
the
could
same
say a lot
time.
more about that, but now I think
I don't like this arm movement.
And then go to the final thing, which I will just more point into the future. But I do want to include it because I'm quite excited about its possibilities. So it is how are the grid sets organized in anatomical space. So I mentioned that at the beginning of my talk. I said that there is some salt and pepper-like random organization of grid phase. But I mean, there is a problem with the tetros or with the electrophysiological recordings that the spatial resolution isn't all that good. You can't really tell whether two cells on the same electrode are neighbors or just almost neighbors. So this you can't tell. So you need different methods for that. And a different method is the use of optical imaging approaches, where you actually apply a microscope. You use a 2-photon microscope, and you apply it onto the brain and look at all of the cells, and then see their activity as the animal is navigating in space. But how can you do that with entorhinal cortex? Because entorhinal cortex is in the most hopeless place in the brain. It's located here. Here you have the cerebellum, and here, to make things really bad, you have this sinus lying up here, which collects all the blood, and if you break that, then you're really in trouble. So, and the rat is in trouble.
Especially for
so
a mouse.
You don't want to do that. But how can you then get the microscope in down here and image entorhinal cortex from the surface? Well, there is a way to do it. You can use a prism. And the nice thing, which Albert Sau in our lab did, was that he applied such a prism and simply just squeezed it in between the cerebrum and the cerebellum without damaging any of them at all, just pushing the cerebellum back and getting the prism down here. So that's illustrated
What
here, the
the
prism there,
fuck,
coming
dude?
down between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. And then now the prism aligns with the entorhinal surface, and then what is imaged is then projected up here, and you can apply your 2-photon microscope right on top of it and actually image the surface of the entorhinal surface.
How insane,
And,
dude.
This shows just an example of that. This is then a mouse that is now navigating
motherfucker's-
virtual reality, a technique that you probably are familiar with. So it's running on this ball, and as this is what it sees,
They got him in
linear
Blade
environments,
Runner.
and this is good enough for creating spatial activity. Has some challenges. We'll come back to that. But the animal is navigating like this. Then what Albert did was so this is in collaboration with the Tobias Bonhoeffer lab in Munich. Images then, this is a window that shows the entorhinal surface, and there's 6 sub-windows that are shown here, and one of them you see here, and the mouse is then moving from left to right here with a red dot, and you can see the individual cells here lighting up whenever they fire. This is like calcium spikes, but nonetheless, this is...
And they're mapping every one of these. They're watching, like that one lit up. Is that one? Or is that one? Wait, no, it's that one. And then I saw it again. I saw it again. Wait, I saw it again. I saw it. You know how tedious this shit is, bro?
No shit.
they express GCamp6 so that you can actually approximate the...
You know what that looks like to me? It looks like the top of a thunderstorm.
Yeah, no shit.
Well, as they navigate in this virtual environment. And now we can tell which cells are neighbors, which are not, and so on. And this just shows some examples of such cells, which are presumably grid cells. You can see, so this is, on the x-axis, you have the distance from beginning to start to end of the track, and then this is lap number, and you can see the repetitive firing like this. And some cells do not show this repetitive firing. And finally, just show examples of such cells. So this is a window of several hundred cells, and then the blue ones are the ones that are likely to be grid cells, and this allows us then to study the spatial pattern of these cells and how they are clustered.
Yeah, so that's that.
I am in awe that we're able to shove pyramids into rats' heads and watch in real time as their brain communicates.
I'm surprised that
Are
we
you
deciphered.
kidding me?
How the fuck did they figure out that when this little motherfucker walks, this one fires when it's here? It fires here. Watch.
Right.
When it's moving, watch. There it is. You saw it?
There it is. Yeah.
Dude, that's fucking...
And it's...
You know how big the brain is? How did they find that specific part? Like, dude, this is the point about the doctrine. Like, the way that science is being built, it's like the foundations of this person led to this person, led to this,
Yeah.
led to this. So life is... Everything that we're doing now is about progress. So all you motherfuckers that are talking about we need to go back... Oh, shut up.
Well, I'm... How does... So... You take it as like a leadership thing, and it's a funnel. But then if you also lay that on its side, that funnel is ever expansive behind you as well. Of that all this prior knowledge before you is tunneling here. As long as you're looking for it in some way. Which, obviously, this is the right gang to be looking for that. But I'm really... stuck on the hardware portion of this, man. Like, it's really cool that science is able to do this. The implications that this makes, just like the last video we had, is infinite. Because the amount of assumptions that I'm making off of this is probably unhealthy. Like, I feel like I'm getting answers to a test that I've been reviewing for too long. It was the same thing when I read Sapolsky's shit. I was like, oh, well, this all makes sense now. I'm a genius.
Yep.
Like, I feel like I know less than ever, though. I feel like now, like, you're crossing those thresholds. Like, this was a don't know that I don't know. Big time. Big time. It wasn't even something that I was analyzing. I didn't know that we were even able to see this shit.
Yeah.
I thought that all the cartoon representations, like Jimmy Neutron, dude, when he's having a brain blast and it's all the electro shit going off in his noodle. I thought that was just for shits and giggles. It's not. It's not. Like, it's identifiably electric. Like, it's emitting light, bro. Like, obviously, like, they're having a system that's identifying this. I doubt that there's actual, like, light admittance coming from these areas, but, like, they're able to map it to some degree using what?
If it's a prism, bro, it's light. If it's a prism,
that's what I'm saying.
It's light
like,
for sure.
Which is horrifying. Like, that's a fucking scary idea. That there's all these little, like, fucking static electricity in here.
What's interesting to me is I've done like, when I say research, I mean I've read. But
Sure.
I've done some research into the way Tesla develops its self-driving cars. And everything in that is in line with everything that we just watched.
Yeah.
The way that it determines edge detection and so on and so forth. But not even just that. I'm talking about the machine learning part of it too, where like there's when basic bit machines or whatever, you guys kind of taught me about this, you and Sanchez, where it was just like, if on off, if this is on, this on means this, like
Right.
a bit, like a
Binary code.
like
0
your
is
basic-
none, 1 is 1.
like my computer here has a BIOS, like basic input output system. And then from that BIOS, it determines other things. And then those other things it just continues to build on top of it. Like,
That's exactly right.
and then our brain is doing the exact same processes is happening in our brain.
Right.
But what's interesting to me is that if you don't use, or if you have been exposed or habituated to certain experiences, certain parts of your brain don't fucking work.
No.
And then we wonder why criminals continue to be criminals when they've
Right.
been in these experiences. It's almost like robots that have not had their fucking thing turned on. And I think
100%.
the Matrix is telling me
100%.
to stop talking. So.
Yeah. Well, just to break from what you just said is that the shallower you go, especially with artificial intelligence, the most simple form of AI is behavior tree bases. And this is what we find in most video games, if not almost every video game. It's probably 99%. I don't know of any AI that's really like machine learning driven in a game. But what I'm getting at is that each tree starts with awake, like this is now awake, or alive, or whatever you want to say, and then it has, as simple as we can think, is patrol or eat, right? So now from awake, it can choose to either patrol an area or eat. Now, if it can't eat, it's going to patrol. And if it can't patrol, it's going to eat. But let's say it goes to patrol and it sees the player or another stimulus. Well, now you have another branch, maybe 4 drop down from that. That it runs, it attacks, it hides, or it flees, or I already said that. So whatever, we'll go with those 3. So again, it can't make any decisions off of that tree. Like it's stuck in that tree. But it gives this persona that it's this intelligent own creature. I'm having a hard time getting to where I was going with that, but it's very strange to me, because then you take this to the idea, like I believe almost all human beings act in that nature of a behavior tree, that we wake up in the day, void awake, we're here, okay. We sit up, we go to the living room, we're going to eat. Okay, well, there's no food in the house, so I'm going to drink coffee, or I'm going to sit on the couch. Well, then now I'll go to the store and get food. And it's all this, like, reactive living, because that's what a behavior tree boils down to. It's reactions. Reactions to stimuli, right? The further you dig into what we're looking into, the further you're seeing that, like, yes, there is a behavior tree at play, but you can act on that as well. Because if you're aware of the test's answers, bro, like, you gotta break the box after you know you're in it. I don't know, you know? It's very fucking cool. Now I'm gonna start trying to memorize rooms differently. Like, I'm gonna try to fuck myself up.
Well, there's an orienting principle of like what you were talking about the VR thing, and then your brain like does that, and then you're like, oh, well now I'm here. It's the same when you get lost. But what you were saying just a second ago, bro, all I thought about is Calvinistic Christians and predeterminism. And if
Oh,
we
for
all
sure.
are operating off of this behavior tree, where the fuck is free will come into effect? Because I think at the end of the day, like for me personally, the argument for free will is, if you tell me I don't have free will, I could punch you in the face in that moment, or I could not. And if you tell me
Yeah.
I'm like, but then at the end on the other side of that coin, they can be like, well, you were always going to do whatever it was that you did. I feel like there's always an out that way.
Pretty much. I mean, so I was just listening to a podcast today that talked briefly about that, especially from a position of religion. And the bring up was that like there's nothing that God can't see that's going to occur, right? There's no outcome that's unknown to God. However, there are things that he will let occur. So there's the balance of the scales that he will allow to happen, and that nothing is unknown. So yes, you could punch that person in the face or not, but based on that choice alone, that outcome was already predisposed, and that person believes, well, if you did punch me in the face, then that was something that I can't understand from my human perspective, because I trust and love God to know that that was good for me, which is asinine to me. I can't get on board with that at all. But it's a Lex Friedman. He's speaking to a Islamic researcher or philosopher of sorts. It's one of his newer ones. It's really good.
I think there's something to be said there though, that because I said this to you before about thinking about everything as good or at least necessary.
Right.
And for me, that was a pretty pivotal thing. What is the difference between machine learning and AI? Isn't machine learning, there's a bunch of rules, like rule sets,
Pretty much.
and then
So
AI is just decision
as
trees?
as far as AI can be at the simplest possible level, right? So we talk about AI in its simplest forms can be in like video games or in random number generators, or like even like the rudimentary, like those really basic chat bots. I don't know if you remember some of the old ones. Yeah, is that when you go on them, like it wasn't a conversation. It gave the perception of a conversation because it was tapping into a shit ton of arrays based on your inputs. So if you said God, it had this many replies to God, and then you said who is, well, it has a plethora of replies to that, right? So at its rudimentary core, an AI is in my opinion, like a box checker and a digger. Like they dig through crates of things, and they're like, oh, well, he said blue, so I go to the blue box and I look through all the blue things, and then okay, here's blue. Same with like if you play Fallout, like the zombies aren't going to touch you if you're not within a certain radius of them. And then all of a sudden, once you get into that radius, you're in their stimuli zone, and now they can hear you or see you or smell you or whatever, and they come after you. Right? Up until that, they're just fucking doing nothing. They're on the branch of the tree of patrol, look alive, right? It's just animations looping. It's that kind of shit. Now, as far as machine learning goes, and I'm not really good with machine learning, you are giving this bot an empty array to fill with a job that dedicates what can go into the array. So it's the polar opposite system. Instead of withdrawal, it's input. So you have, for instance, if you wanted to make a robot be able to navigate a maze, well, what do you need for that? You need edge detection, you need speed, and you need direction of travel. Right? As far as it goes, you can use those three things. If it runs into a wall, it dies, or it deletes and has to restart. And if it moves in the opposite direction in which it was walking, it again restarts. And if it exceeds or mitigates below a certain speed or above a certain speed, it also has to reset the maze. Well, this fucking thing is going to run that maze 3,000 times a second or whatever it is, right? Like it's working off of machine time, kind of like our dream states is what I've always equated that to, is that the time dilation in my dream is not 1-to-1 to reality at all.
And like in the sharp wave ripples.
Right, exactly. So then you release this AI into its fucking simulation of running this maze, and it's going to learn every time it hits a wall, it puts that into the box. That cannot turn left on step 5. Can't do it. Not good, right? Cannot slow down on step 3. Cannot fucking turn right on step 10. And it keeps filling that array, that box, until it gets through the maze. And then now you can start introducing it to novel environments, and that array, as that array diversifies, as that box widens, that thing starts making decisions based on knowledge, based on prior experience. So just like self-driving cars, every single time a Tesla wrecks, the road just got that much safer. Because it tells every other Tesla across the planet, don't merge. Like, don't do that. Like, bad move.
So what's interesting to me, first, that's hive mind shit, and that scares me. But what's interesting to me, what you just said, was there's a video recently that came out with Jordan Peterson talking about how he's terrified of ChatGPT. And everything that you just described of ChatGPT, I'm like, so you really are out here crying wolf, and you're really afraid of this thing. I'm like, oh, everything you just said.
Now, granted,
like checked a bunch of boxes.
ChatGPT might be more advanced than what I'm describing, because I was talking more like the early 2010s era. I can't remember the website.
When you use the word more advanced, I feel like you're really saying more resolution, and more resolution in this
absolutely
case is just a larger
array.
Just
a larger array.
Yeah.
Yep.
That doesn't mean that it has. This is my point. Was that I also read something just right before we started this video about this AI, and for 6 days, Marines were like going against this AI and allowing it to detect them, right? To track humans, basically, was what it was learning. And then the very last day, the dude was like, "All right, now beat it." And then 2 of the Marines somersaulted for 300 meters. And got to it without it detecting them. 2 of them put cardboard boxes on and just walked up to it. And then the third one just pretended he was a tree and walked up. So like, an AI can't determine those things because those things were never in its boxes. And even now, the edge detection on that and like the amount of shit you have to do to make it be able to do that is astronomical. Versus
100%.
what a fucking child can do in 6 months.
Correct. So, and this becomes an argument of wisdom, right? Is that we might argue that it's like it's foolish to believe an AI is intelligent based on the size of its thesaurus or its dictionary or its array or its knowledge base. That's exactly what human wisdom is. It's exactly what it is that I can draw from this array of experiences and say, no, man, look, like, you shouldn't cross the road without looking both ways, bro. Do you want to get smashed? Like, that's not what you want. You know, the only reason why I know that is because I've seen someone get smashed by a car not looking both ways. So I put that into my array.
I want to say something a little differently, where for visually in my mind, I'm seeing like a pyramid, and at the bottom, there's a bunch of tiny little details of very specific things, and AI and machine learning are working off of those. But I feel like humans operate on categories and concepts. It's not
100%.
It's not. It's like a ball is a ball is a ball is a ball is a ball, but to an AI or machine learning, it's not.
Basketball.
Yeah.
Baseball.
It's not that way.
Yeah. Well, so I argue this multiple times, training with SWAT, training with my guys in the guard with you and everything, dude, is that you can't train to context. You have to train to concept. Because the context doesn't fucking matter. A house is a house is a house. Stairs are stairs. Environments like this are environments like this.
And that gets me in trouble in my relationships.
Correct. Because on the reverse side of things, dude, relationships are all context, no concept. Because it's very personal, and it gets me in trouble more than I want to admit. But it's very hard, I think, and it's extremely strenuous when you've chosen professions that require you to always think as broad as possible until the execution. Right? Everything we do is this rhombus style approach to things where it's like, well, let me encompass all of it. Okay, we're good. We're executing. Bam. We're on point. Minimum thoughts, minimum fucking analysts. We step back. We see a bigger picture at the time, but really it's a strategic element of that small portion, right? It's very hard to take that and then go to your woman or your significant other or whatever and be like, no, like the house is fine. Like it's standing. There's no life or death consideration here. Yes, the dishes aren't done, but did anybody die? You know what I mean? Like it's not transferable.
In this relationship, this is okay. Well, that's not our fucking relationship.
Bingo, dude.
Yeah.
And that's one of my hardest points to realize. I've shamefully made it routine to say, like, in every other context I can talk to people like this. I can't talk to you like that?
Yeah.
And you're telling me I'm wrong? Yeah, I'm toxic as fuck, dude, Like, I'm toxic.
I feel
That's
like
such a terrible...
The concept there, I feel like, is Republicans versus Democrats, or rights versus lefts, right? So the right always wants to say, this is Jordan Peterson 101, you can't, what does he say, coerce my words. You can't tell me what to say.
Yeah.
Motherfucker, tell that to your wife, bro.
Yeah. No shit.
You can't do
like
that.
Unless you just have like the most subservient audience around you, like...
Yeah.
You're in the wrong spot, bro. Like,
Well,
if you
that's Christianity. If he's
oh,
the
it's
man,
disgusting.
If he's the man, what he says goes, and he doesn't have to curtail his language to anybody.
No,
You know what I'm saying?
it's his to be had,
Yeah.
and that's gross, dude. Like, I don't want to live in a world like that. However, I find myself offended when people don't agree with me.
Yeah.
So I'm like, okay, like, you know what I mean, dude?
Yeah.
Like, it's a curse, man.
When
It's a curse.
The other side of that, though, is like everything you say, you offended me, so now you need to change the way that you're talking. It's like, wait, hold up. Like, at some point, there's this middle ground, this centrist idea of some things are my fault, and some things you need to fucking take care of yourself. Like,
Right.
if I'm walking down the street, like, I don't know, when you're in the army, if somebody's ignorant to something, it's not your fault, bro. You didn't know.
Yeah.
And it's my job to teach you. So if I misgender you and you lose your fucking mind on me, that's not my problem, that's yours.
Nah, dude.
But if you're
you
like,
chose
yo,
that.
I'm
Yeah.
a she, like, all right,
And I
ma'am.
start being, what's up, bro?
Yeah, like, now I'm a dickhead. But if I was
Yeah,
like,
now
all
I'm
right, all right,
now I'm a
ma'am.
piece of shit.
All right, ma'am, and then I just walk the fuck off because I don't want to interact with you. It is what it is. But I don't have to go out of my way to be a dickhead. And
No.
it's the same. It's the same way. Like where my boy, one of my first podcasts, my boy told me that both of his dads were gay or whatever, right? And if I had said, and he was like, we made this point where it's like if I had said some like derogatory thing towards gay people and he got offended by it and he brought it up to me, I just wouldn't do that anymore.
Yeah.
And it would be over. But
Yeah.
some people are like, you just broke every tenet. Like, how the fuck was I supposed to know, bro? Like, I'm not in your head.
Yeah.
And that's
How was I supposed to know who you are, dude? Like, I know your name. Like, I don't know who your parents were. Like, what the fuck?
so that's that context part of like with your wife, you're supposed to learn what it is that they want, what they don't want, and then with you too, it's like there's that saying of like I'm always trying to be a better man today than I was yesterday, and it's we're both trying to build on these principles and these things.
Right.
So the next video, we're going to talk about how I'm going to show you how these grid cells actually compute positional information, because if you have a grid cell and it fires every time you're at any one of those points, how do you even get your spatial location? How does that even tell you anything? Do you see what I'm saying? How does any of that mean anything? And that's
Yeah,
what we're gonna
what's
talk
what's
about.
the subjective nature